Hello everyone, good afternoon, and thank you for registering and attending our webinar today. I'm just going to wait a couple more minutes before we begin so that everyone has joined, and then we'll start. Great, so I can see that quite a few of you have joined us, so thank you. Hello, my name is Kirsty and I work for the Waste Prevention team at the North London Waste Authority. So we often receive lots of questions from our residents on what can and can't be recycled. And so we thought it'd be really useful to produce this webinar to help answer some of these questions. In particular, we're going to be focusing on the things that can't be recycled, which in the industry we also refer to as contamination. So next slide, please, Anne. So just a few technical announcements. Do feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. There should be on the right hand corner a question mark box, and you should be able to put all your questions in there. We will have a question and answer session at the end of the webinar, but feel free to answer throughout and we'll get back to you on those. And then if we do run out of time, please do email us your questions. We've got our email address at the end of the presentation. So I've got a couple of colleagues on hand who are helping with the questions as well, so thank you so much. And then if you did want to use subtitles, that you see the CC logo, that should be on the bottom right hand corner of the webinar screen, and you can pop that on if you would like to. But please note, we've had a couple of comments just to say it's not as accurate as they would like, so do bear that in mind. So we'll just begin with talking a little bit about background about NLWA. So the North London Waste Authority, also known as NLWA, is a statutory waste disposal authority for the 7 North London boroughs, as you can see on the map on the right. And the key priority for NLWA is to arrange for the recycling and treatment for most of these boroughs, managing the reuse and recycling centres and promoting waste minimisation and recycling. And as I mentioned, the team that I work for is the Waste Prevention team. And the key priorities for our team is to educate residents living and working in North London on waste prevention activities. And we do that in a range of ways. So normally we would be delivering community events, presentations like this one, but face-to-face, engaging with businesses, having stalls, doing upcycling workshops. And we also have a schools education programme. So you may have attended some of our events in the past, or before COVID-19, we might have seen you face to face. But yeah, due to COVID-19, as you know, we've been running a series of webinars like this one. So we hope you enjoy it. And then just to say that today, my lovely colleague Anne Baker from our Strategy and Services team at NLWA will be talking about what contamination is. It's a term that we use within the waste and recycling industry. We'll be looking at some photos and really getting down to see what it looks like, and how this contamination could cause issues when it gets to the recycling facility, and what we can all do to reduce this problem. So over to you, Anne. Thank you very much.
Hey, hello everyone, and thank you all for registering and joining us today to find out more about recycling contamination. In this webinar, I'll talk to you about contamination, what it is, and why it's important that we do all we can to tackle it. The recycling plants we use for mixed dry recycling, also known as MRFs, are increasingly sophisticated and able to sort and process recyclable material very effectively. But when non-recyclable items get mixed up with recyclable products, or recyclable items are put into the wrong container, they can't be processed and can damage the materials that we really want to save. In 2018, in the UK, there were 467,000 tonnes of contaminated recycling, which was disposed of as waste. This is equivalent to 37,661 London Routemaster buses, which is a huge amount. And so we're working hard to help people to do the right thing with their recycling and reduce this amount of contamination. Not only is it a waste of resources, but it costs as well. Last year, recycling contamination for the North London Waste Authority boroughs cost an estimated £1.5 million to dispose of. Usually people want to do the right thing, and this includes everyone from the collection crews through to householders, but they may not have been given the information or tools they need to use the service as it was intended, nor understand the impacts of this if mistakes are made. So what is contamination and recycling, and anything else in between? MRF operators want as many of the high value, good quality materials as possible, as these have strong and secure end markets for reprocessing. For the MRF, these items are classified as target materials or recyclables. After the target materials, we have the lower value items that have little or no monetary worth with unstable markets. These are known as non-target materials, which may be recyclable depending on market conditions at a specific period in time. Usually you'll find that the MRF will accept these products, but it may not be always possible to recycle them. The other materials that don't fall into the former two categories are identified as non-recyclable items, which can be objectionable and even prohibitive items. Not only are there no end markets for them, but they could damage the good recycling, the MRF equipment, and possibly be a health hazard. And I'll go into more detail on each of these in the next few slides. So recyclables are the materials that are ideal for MRFs and what the MRF technology is designed for. They include valuable items such as metals, plastic containers, paper, glass and card. These items have reliable end markets and are likely to generate an income. There are market fluctuations with demand and prices, but this doesn't normally affect the overall market stability, and they are a constant regular feedstock for the MRFs. What is important is that these items are clean, and so pizza boxes, for example, should be free from grease and aluminium cleaner food residues. Non-target recycling includes things that you would normally expect to be recycled, but the value of these items or the ability to recycle them varies depending on market conditions. They may become target materials if the value increases, or they may become a burden if there are costs to dispose of them. For example, if glass is used to make new containers, it tends to go back to the colour it was, so green bottles become green containers. But there is very little blue glass, so it is more difficult to process. It can be turned into aggregate, but this is not as valuable financially or environmentally as good as remelted glass. Pet food pouches are made from more than one material, so are difficult to sort, and reprocessing options for these items are limited. Black plastic trays are not easily detected by the infrared rays used for sorting plastics, so not easily captured for recycling. However, retailers are modifying their trays to different colours and even using different materials such as cards, so that it's more easy to identify these in the sorting process. And shredded paper can get caught up in the machinery at the MRF, so although it's accepted, we do ask people to put it in an envelope before it goes into the recycling bin. So what the MRFs really don't want, and what causes problems with efficiency and material quality, are what they class as rejectable items and their objectionable and prohibitive waste or contaminants. So on this slide, there are some items there that you can see should not really be in the waste stream. These are textiles, a rubber ball and some hard plastics. These other contaminants can also include nappies, food and garden waste. They all cause problems for the MRF equipment, with textiles getting caught up in the machinery, nappies and food waste ruining the clean paper and card, and medical waste being a danger to the site operatives. What is particularly frustrating is many of the items can be recycled, but just not through a MRF. Textiles have a value and can be taken to on-street recycling banks, donated to charity shops and exchanged through online groups such as eBay and FreeCycle. Most councils provide garden waste collection services and subsidise home composting bins. Many also collect food waste, so there's really no need for any of this to go in the mixed dry recycling or onto the MRF. Clinical waste collections can be organised through the NHS service, and needles and old medication can be returned to local pharmacies. So again, no need to put them in the recycling box. On the next few slides, we'll look at some more real-life examples of what has turned up at the MRF from recycling collections in the North London Waste Authority area. So I'll give you a few seconds to see if you can spot the contaminants in this slide. Oops. So you can see nappies, which are a real problem for the MRF by the nature of their contents. They're absolutely not recyclable and should go back into the black bag waste. But for some reason, whether it's the labelling on the package or something else, people seem to think they can be recycled. Again, I'll give you a few seconds to have a look in this load and see the items that shouldn't be here. So in this slide, we have a broken fan and some sort of electrical gadget and cable. This is electrical waste and should not be put in the recycling. There are in-store take-back schemes for these types of items. Some councils offer curbside collections for small electrical waste, and you can also take them to reuse and recycling centres. In some boroughs, there are also on-street banks for electrical goods. This slide shows something that should be pretty evident. How did a tyre get to the plant without being spotted sooner? A tyre needs to be treated at a specialist facility and obviously doesn't fit into any of the target materials we want. This particular one is a real concern as there is some manual sorting at the MRF, so medical waste and needles is a potential health hazard for the site staff. Again, here you can probably see this one, which is evident. This is a gas tank, and if you empty these, they can be taken to your recycling centre or returned to the supplier. Again, like other hazardous sort of waste, these can cause problems in collections. They are fire risk in recycling collection vehicles, which are like batteries, so we don't want these in the waste at all. And they're also compacted in the vehicle, so it's another risk of explosions too. Finally, on this side, you can see a skateboard and then a bag with what looks like food waste. Bags are split at the MRF, and so any food waste can spoil the clean, dry paper and card, which can cause it to get caught in the machinery and reduce its quality so that it's not accepted at the paper and board mills. So what happens at the MRF? Once your household recycling has been collected, it's delivered to the MRF, and when it arrives, the vehicle is weighed and then directed to unload at the tipping hall, as you see in the slide. And this is where the contents are visually inspected for levels of contamination and to see whether it's spread throughout the load or isolated to a specific area. The contamination thresholds are that an acceptable load has less than 15% contamination, a downgraded load has between 15 and 25% contamination, and a rejected load has more than 25% contamination. The next step when the vehicle has tipped is to take a sample from the most contaminated section of the load and count the individual contaminants or contras that are in the sample. If there are more than 15 contras, further sampling is done to determine the extent of the contamination and whether or not the whole load should be rejected. The findings from this exercise are sent to the boroughs so they can use the information to take appropriate action. If there is a full or part rejection, the contaminated material will be disposed of as waste. And if the load is fully or partly acceptable, then it begins the sorting process. So once tipped, the acceptable materials are then loaded onto a conveyor belt to the first pre-sort cabin for a visual check. Here, obvious contaminants such as nappies, textiles and food are removed by hand, as well as larger items such as cardboard, which you can see in the photo. The next stage of the process is onto an OCC conveyor belt. An OCC stands for old corrugated card or containers. Any contamination on this belt can halt its operation, and this is where cables, textiles, food and other contaminants can cause problems if they get caught up in the machinery. After the OCC conveyor, the materials continue to pass through a number of further automated sorting systems using air currents, magnets and optical sorters to separate materials and contaminants. It's very important here that no contamination affects the operation of the conveyor belts, as it could potentially stop the process of the whole MRF for hours. Then at the end of the mechanical sorting process and prior to baling, there is a final manual quality inspection to pick out any further contamination. The materials are then baled, checked for moisture levels, as there are restrictions on the moisture content for materials being recycled into other products, and then they are sent onwards for reprocessing. It's important to keep the MRF operating as smoothly as possible and reduce the risk of breakdowns. They operate 24/7 and any downtime costs money and backlogs and delays for deliveries to the plant, which benefits no one. So why do people contaminate? The reasons why are very varied and many, and can include the following. It can start right at the beginning of the collection day at the depot. If a driver forgets to check their vehicle before they leave the depot and it has already some residual waste in it from the day before, this will end up in the recycling mix. People are also often very keen to recycle as much as they can. Even if they're not sure if something is recyclable, they will put it in the recycling bin just in case. On the flip side, some people are confused about the recycling systems, especially where two-compartment vehicles are used, so mix rubbish and recycling anyway, as they're not sure if it would have ever been recycled. If there are restrictions on residual waste, such as fortnightly collections or limits on the amount allowed, some people will hide their excess rubbish in the recycling bins, which may be collected more frequently or have larger size than the refuse. This is hard for the crews to spot, as they only lift the bin lid to do a quick visual inspection, so may not see the contaminants. If recycling and refuse bins are not well located, people will just use the one closest to them, and this tends to be more of an issue where there are shared containers for communal properties. Since the introduction of plastics to collection services, avoiding contamination is even more tricky. Labelling on packaging can be confusing, especially for plastics with triangle symbols and polymer numbers. Sometimes labelling advises you to contact your local council to check if something can be recycled. So extra effort is required to find out, which can be off-putting for some people. In London in particular, the population is very transient, and so with different services from borough to borough, it is challenging for people to stay updated about their local services. Advice can be confusing and the range of items is too varied. So when we put our recycling out for collection, we might get a satisfying feeling that we're doing our bit for the planet, but not all the items we put in the recycling bin will end up being recycled. People take time to recycle, and the crews are collecting the recycling and transporting it to the MRF for sorting. All of this uses fuel, time and labour to process something that is ultimately wasted if it's contaminated, and it also costs more to dispose of waste than recycle it. At a national and regional level, the problem of contamination and the importance of recycling good quality materials is well recognised. The government's Resource and Waste Strategy 2018 has 4 key policy drivers to strengthen the management of resources and waste. These are not specifically targeted at contamination, but they will strengthen the market for recyclables and indirectly affect contamination as the demand to recycle more increases and new sorting technology evolves. The 4 policy levers they are introducing are the introduction of consistent recycling collections, which will have a core set of materials at the heart of them, which will be collected from households, providing clarity over what can and can't be recycled and will help improve material quality. They are also looking at a deposit return scheme, which provides an economic incentive to recycle drinks containers. So like the old days, for those who can remember, you get money back on your old fizzy drinks bottle when you return it to the shop. There will be a plastic packaging tax, which will help build demand for recycled plastic. They're currently hard to recycle plastics, such as plastic packaging, will be taxed at £200 per tonne if it does not have at least 30% recycled content. And then finally, there'll be extended producer responsibility for packaging, where the government has made a clear commitment to increase the recycling of packaging waste and the recyclability of it. Also for the MRFs, there are regulatory requirements that for those that receive more than 1,000 tonnes of recycling a year. The aim of this legislation is to improve the quality of the recyclables and ensure that the materials from mixed recycling collections is of equivalent quality to that from segregated collections. Details of MRF inputs and output material must be reported to the Environment Agency, and they must report the average composition of target materials, non-target materials and non-recyclable material. There are industry standards as well, such as EN 643 for paper, which specifies the limits of unwanted components in the mix, such as hazardous waste, food waste and toxic powders, and PAS 101 for glass, which specifies cross-colour contamination limits. National and local organisations are also working closely to support the reduction in contamination and increase recycling. Following some in-depth studies on recycling on estates, Resource London have produced a toolkit to identify the cost of contamination to a local authority. Keep Britain Tidy have recently undertaken a study on tackling contamination, and in London, local authorities have strong networking groups where they share best practice on managing contamination. MRF operators and reprocessors are developing new technology all the time to sort a wider range of items and better manage contamination. Packaging labelling is also being improved, with more companies subscribing to the on-pack recycling label scheme so that it is clearer to know how to recycle or dispose of packaging. Some approaches that have been developed on the ground to tackle contamination are Eurobins with plastic or mesh sides that have been trialled so that contamination can be spotted more easily before it goes in the back of the collection vehicle. There are also different lid designs with restricted apertures to reduce the opportunity for the wrong items to be put in a container. Toolbox talks with crews have been developed and helps remind them why their role is so important in tackling contamination and what to do if they come across it. As the frontline service, they are first control in preventing contaminants going into the vehicle and onto the MRF. Their response will provide the information required by communication and engagement officers to inform and educate service users about contamination. Communications are often overlooked, but key in tackling contamination and supporting behaviour change. If people don't understand their role in the recycling chain, then it won't work. Feedback and information is important for service users to understand why their bins haven't been emptied if contaminated, and harsher measures such as removing the containers can be taken as a last resort if the problem persists. So North London Waste, what do we do? So we have a working group with the seven constituent boroughs and BIFA, the MRF operator, which meets on a regular basis to drive down contamination and increase recycling. There is a joint recycling fund provided by us and BIFA this year of £76,000, which is to improve recycling and/or tackle contamination. The applications for this funding should find out if they were successful very soon. We also provide information about recycling and contamination on our website, and also use social media to promote topical messages about key contaminants, which has recently included nappies. The MRF contract is the responsibility of North London Waste Authority, and it's in everyone's interest that we manage this effectively. We are committed to maintaining a good working relationship with the MRF operator and ensuring there is transparency with all aspects of the recycling process through to end destinations, and working together with our partners to tackle contamination. We support the boroughs with their communications and activities regarding contamination and provide service data and reports so they can target their resources more effectively on this. So on that note, I've come to the end of the presentation. I'd like to thank you all for listening, and I hope you found it useful. I'll now hand back to Kirsty.
Thank you so much, Anne. That was really interesting. So we are now starting the Q&A part of today's webinar, and I can see we've had loads and loads of questions come through already. So I'll go through some of those. I believe my colleague Val might also chip in with some of the answers as well. So some of your questions might have already been answered, so I'll try and read out the ones that haven't. And there's loads of great questions. So straight away from Chris, we've got a question about how we deal with coffee cups, and what do you do with the compostable coffee cups? So there's a few different questions in this. So we'll start with an answer about coffee cups. Unfortunately, in the household recycling, we don't currently accept coffee cups. So that's not something we would process at the MRF in North London with BIFO. They don't currently accept those. So unfortunately, please don't put your coffee cups into your household recycling. However, I know lots of coffee shops at the moment do accept recycling services and do accept them in the coffee shops and things like that. So I hope that helps to answer your question, Chris. Let's find another one. We've had quite a few questions about Tetra Packs and whether or not those can be recycled. They are currently recyclable in North London. However, the composition of Tetra Pak does make it slightly more difficult to recycle than normal cardboard, for example. Would you agree, Anne?
Yeah, I mean, there is a problem sort of identifying through the sorting process, and when they go through, if they're captured, they will go onwards for recycling, but not all of them are captured. So it's a tricky one, and it's one of those in the grey area that are non-target. So where it's possible to recycle them, we will, but they're not always captured.
Thank you, Anne. And then, yeah, sorry, we do refer to contamination and MRF quite often. So MRF stands for Material Recovery Facility. And just to, I'm sure Anne's covered it, but just in case. So once your recycling is collected from the household in North London, it will be transported in a recycling vehicle to a sorting facility where all the materials that are all mixed together get sorted out separately for recycling. And that's called a material recovery facility. And that's what we mean when we say MRF. So let's see if we can find some more of your questions. Loads of them have been answered, so thank you. So a lot of people have also asked if we will be recording this webinar. Yes, we will. So do check back on our website later today or tomorrow, and the recording should be up there for you. If you aren't able to access the entire thing or would like to rewatch, that's absolutely fine. So someone's mentioned the clear packaging and the confusion about what the supermarkets say and the fact that it's quite confusing. And do you work with retailers to work out what can and can't be recycled? So yes, I suppose the answer to that would be we definitely work with BIFA, who also then in turn work with retailers, is my understanding. And then do you want to mention something about the some of the responses, the government responses to consultations, Anne, because I know they very much impact this question.
Yeah, so there is government consultation out about packaging. The next round of consultation is due out later this year. So there was some last year, around May, I believe, last year. So we responded to that and highlighted the issue around the packaging, and through RAP and other bodies there is also sort of behind the scenes lobbying going on, but we will certainly be feeding that back in the next round of consultation. And I think the OPRL scheme it's been running for a while, and RAP are promoting that, or the packaging industry, I think it is, sorry, are promoting that, and there are more and more companies signing up to it. So unofficially there's work happening on that, but more officially through the government consultation we'll be feeding back on that again later this year.
Thank you, Anne. And then so we had another question about how much deposited plastics are actually recycled. Oh, that's quite a vague question. So at any one time, we're recycling different amounts of plastics at our MRF. So it really depends on what's being recycled and when. I don't at the top of my head have an exact figure, but I imagine I could get back to you on that if you send us an email. And then the second part of that question was what happens to products that are rejected? So yeah, great question. So basically, as Anne was showing you in the photos, if the percentage of contamination is really high, so above around, was it 15%, Anne?
For a whole load to be rejected, it's 25%, but 25. Yeah.
So then that would have to, the entire load would then have to go as waste. So usually that would be energy from waste, or that would be in landfill, depending on the service. And then we had a great question from Ruth, which was, our estate has to use on-street recycling bins. What happens to the bin if rainwater gets in it? Well, basically, great question. Cardboard generally can't get wet before it goes to the MRF. If it does, unfortunately, that it does mean that it can't be recycled. However, the other items, as long as, you know, they can dry off by the time they get sorted, like all the plastics and metals, I imagine they would be okay. Would you agree, Anne?
Yeah, that's about right. And it depends even with the paper and card. If it's only a very small amount at the top of the bin that's wet, but everything else is okay.
Out, couldn't it?
Yeah, that would be okay, because it would be such a small percentage of the overall total. It wouldn't have an impact. But if it's obviously the whole bin for some reason has been hosed down and got drenched, that's a different matter. But
exactly.
If it's a bin with a lid and a bit of rainwater, shouldn't damage it too much to the point that it would be rejected.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. And then Kathy asked, I assume that comes from Recycle Now. So Recycle Now is a great resource if you do want to find anything out about your local recycling service, particularly if you don't live in one of the North London boroughs, which is our focus. And then if someone moves into a new house, what information do you share with them? So at the North London Waste Authority, we wouldn't necessarily post things to people's houses unless we were doing a campaign. That would usually come with the council, and you might have to request that information or pop onto their website generally to have a look at what can and can't be recycled in your local area. And I do think it's important to try and reduce the amount of leaflets we get through the doors. So I think more and more we're reducing the amount of information we send. So yeah, then we had another question from Ruth asking about food cartons having a film covering which cannot be recycled. This isn't always easy to remove every trace of the film which can be recycled. Does that matter? Oh, good question, Ruth. Generally, if you can remove as much as you possibly can and make sure, give it a good rinse, that should be okay. Would you agree, Anne?
Yeah, that's what we'd advise. No need to absolutely sort of strip it bare and scrub it down, but a good rinse and whatever you can easily remove, that's the best.
Oh, there's a great question that you might like to answer, Val. Are you okay to answer a question about plastics, Val?
Sure.
Great. So someone's asked what happens to PET bottles that have a different kind of plastic top on them to the bottling, and the anti-tampering ring is, if the anti-tampering ring, I assume that's, I didn't know that was a word, but the ring around the top of the bottle. I'm
imagining that little ring below the lid, isn't it? The top lid.
I think so. I imagine so. Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, PET bottles are of course made of PET. It's a different type of plastic, as well as the lid. The lid is made of PP, which is again a different type of plastic, and they also have different colors most of the time. So they do go for different places, you know, different buyers. They have different prices, and so please, if you could separate them, it would be great. Now the little ring around, of course, if you have the patience to separate, it's even better, but don't worry too much, because you know, if it's a very minor, you know, amount of color added to the transparent bottle. So in a nutshell, yes, please separate the lid, but don't worry too much about the ring.
Great. And then someone had a similar question about the glass bottles with the tampering ring. I imagine that's pretty much the same answer. Like, take the lid off. Obviously, glass and metal are two different materials and would then get sorted separately. Particularly, it's very scientific, but at the MAP, there are lots of like magnets for all the different types of metals to do with density and weight and things like that.
Yeah, so there was another similar question in regards to the size, which I think it fits with this question. If any different sizes, even a smaller lead or very little things, there would be a problem in the MRF, and it's not, because what you just explained, they will be separated by very high tech, you know, jets of air or magnets and so on. So it's not a problem.
And then we had another question about PET containers. So that's a type of plastic, and their paper labels, if they're permanently stuck to them. What would you say to that, Val?
Usually plastics, when you finally get to a processing company, which is the next step after the MRF, that plastic will be washed, and in the process of washing, any paper will be stripped out of that plastic. But of course, it means it is a sort of a contaminant to it. And you can imagine that most of recycling material will have some sort of contaminant. So if you can take as much paper as possible, great. But if it is really stuck to it and it's something really difficult, we can't really be asking you guys to do that. So just the obvious amount of paper.
Great, thank you, Val. And then someone else asked, is the plastic ring that holds the 6-pack drinks together recyclable? No, unfortunately it's not. It's a very thin material type of plastic, and it's very poor quality, and we don't accept it in the house recycling.
The good news is that there are initiatives of those big companies that they are trying to now incorporate instead of using plastic, use paper to combine those cans.
Great, thank you, Val. Another great question, and a question I've definitely answered many times before. So can olive oil glass bottles be recycled, as they are so greasy and difficult to get clean? And generally, what would you say to that one?
Yes, I'd say, again, if you can rinse it out, you know, as clean as it can be, just a rinse is fine. And like the plastics, when it goes for remelt in particular, it's the process of heating it and the rest of it destroys any of those sorts of contaminants. So it's not a problem.
Great, I agree. And yeah, that's a really good point about the heating process as well. I hadn't really thought about that.
And then you keep them for aggregates as well, you know, if it's used for road surfacing, which it quite often is, again, it's not a problem in that process either.
Yeah, so that's when aggregates is when like the little bits of glass gets broken down basically into a sand-like material and then gets used to resurface the road.
There's maybe an interesting point here is to note that some boroughs will recycle your oil, used oil, if you have, but you're going to have to find a place to drop that to. You can't. We will not be collecting those. So just research in your council website and see if this is happening. And please do not put oil through your sink.
No, exactly. Or in the recycling. Or in the general waste bin.
Oh, that's even worse.
Very messy. Unless it's
please not in the recycling.
No, and again with the olive oil glass bottle, yeah, I'm sure most people generally use their olive oil before they recycle it. So yeah, that does have to be empty. And then if you are throwing oil in the bin, make sure it's hard. You know, the hot oil can then set and go hard in like an old container or something. So let's see if we've got any more questions. Let's have a look.
I was just going to say, as a plug for where Val used to work at Terracycle, they're a good organisation to contact if you have got things like cat food pouches and coffee pods and the more tricky things to recycle through your household collection. They tend to do those more unusual things that the MRF can't accept. So that's always a good shout.
Yes, and just to add to it, just to explain, because people might be wondering why they can and we cannot. And the reason is that Terracycle, it basically works for those big companies such as Coca-Cola, McDonald's, that they ask them, can you sort it out our waste? And that's what they do. And it's a lot of money involved. So it's not financially viable in a big scale. And that's why boroughs do not do that. It's mainly a very niche market done by those big companies that usually pollute a lot.
Great, thank you, Val. And then we had another question about the toothpaste tubes. It's impossible to clean those. Generally, in household recycling, we don't accept those toothpaste tubes. So those will have to go into the general waste bin, I'm afraid. So someone asked about the paper/card coated with a very thin plastic film to look shiny and whether or not that can be recycled. Generally, this is quite a tricky question, believe it or not, because it does depend on the type of material and having a look at it to see it. So if it's super, super shiny, I don't know about what you guys think, but I imagine it can't be recycled.
Talking about paper, right?
Yes, yeah.
So basically try to tear this paper. And if it tears and you can see little fibers through it, it's most likely only paper. But when you're trying to tear and it's really rubbery or really hard to, and it's just bending rather, that means that you got plastic in there, so it's not recyclable.
Ah, great tip. Thank you, Val. That's really good. And then what is the best way to recycle electric toothbrush heads? Because they're not technically electric, they probably wouldn't go into the street wee banks, the electrical banks. I would say the best thing to do again would be to find a specific scheme, such as the one Anne and Val mentioned, like with Terracycle or a similar organisation, or even returning to the manufacturer. They might also have a recycling scheme for that as well, but not into recycling, please.
Yes, especially because these toothbrush heads, they have a little metal inside, and this is very difficult to separate. And you got also the head, and it's too complicated.
Mm.
Go ahead, Anne.
No, I was just going to say it's true. I remember doing some work with I think it was the Royal Society of Arts. We're doing some work on things like that, and it's got a ridiculous amount of components in it. It's something like 17 different types of materials in an electric toothbrush, so very tricky. But I always think that contacting the manufacturers is good, because it makes them then think about how they design things, because they're not thinking about the end of the life of their products. They're only looking at the saleability.
Totally.
So by raising it with them, it sort of makes them consider what they're putting on the market.
Exactly, very good point. And I know one obvious example that I've seen quite a few times is when people return the crisp packets back to the manufacturers. That's quite a common one. And then Kathy's also shared a really useful tip. She said you can also do the scrunch test. If the paper springs back, it can't be recycled. If it stays scrunched up, it is non-recyclable. Oh, thank you for that. Shiny gift wrap, again, similar to what we mentioned about the whether or not you tear it and can see the fibres. Again, it would depend. Usually gift wrapping should have information on it as to whether or not it can be recycled, but we all know some of the information about recycling can be confusing on various products. But please, just a note on that one, no glitter. Any cards that have glitter on them, any gift wrap that has glitter, that can affect the machinery at the MRF, the material.
Can I just ask, what was the previous question about the paper, of the crunching thing? Sorry,
what was that, Val? Do you want me to repeat the question?
Yeah, what was the comment of the person that mentioned about crunching paper?
So Kathy provided a tip about if the paper springs back, it can't be recycled, and if it stays scrunched up, that it's non-recyclable.
Okay.
And
I don't think that it would be a specific rule. I think what we need to always remember is the fibers of the paper. So cardboard boxes are very desirable, and A4 white sheets of paper very desirable, because the fibers of the paper is very long, so you can recycle over and over again. It's when it gets really soft, the paper, that like tissue paper, that's not recyclable, even if of course not if it's dirty, but even if it's clean, because the fibers are really small, and that's what is the rule. It's more than anything.
Great, thank you, Val. And we've only got a couple of minutes left on today's webinar. It's gone so quickly, and we've had so many questions. So I do apologise if we haven't got round to your question. As you can see on the screen, that's our email address. Just pop us an email with your question and we'll get back to you, hopefully with even more information than we've been able to provide on the webinar. So yeah, a massive thank you to Anne for presenting today's contamination webinar. It was super interesting. Thank you so much. To Val and to everyone else in the background helping with the questions, and to you guys for attending. Thank you so much. We hope you've enjoyed it. And on that note, I'm going to say goodbye. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.